Who out there wants to write faster? What about writing better? Words that are going to be of a higher quality, words that you know you're actually going to use in your finished draft. Now, can you combine those two together, or are there going to be trade-offs? Spoiler alert, there are trade-offs between writing faster and writing better. And I am here today to give you some of my top tips and tricks about how to increase your word count, but also increase the quality of your words. And first and foremost, make sure that you're making the right decisions for you in terms of your writing goals in this life season. Because of course, I'm all about your whole amazing author life and not just about trying to compete in a specific area or get the highest word count. So if you're ready to learn more about writing faster and writing better and making the best decisions for you, plus learning some of my strangest writing tips for increased word count and fun, make sure that you hang around for this episode. Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Author Culture Podcast, where we're all about helping fiction authors think well, do well, and live well in a chaotic publishing world. I'm super excited you're here. And real quick, if you haven't already, do make sure that you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell on the YouTube channel so that you never miss an episode. And if you're listening to this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or another podcast platform, make sure that you're following or subscribing as you can. And feel free to share this episode with someone else that will help encourage them and uplift their author life. All right, now let's talk all about word count. When we're talking about increasing your word count, we're talking all about your process. And y'all know me, I love talking about processes because processes are that whole way of doing things that you develop and refine and learn more about as you're going about your author life. And they really are that secret between staying at one level in your author life and going on to the next level. It's not about taking someone else's process as a carbon copy or cookie cutter. It's all about taking all these different ideas and figuring out how they fit into your unique process. And so, of course, since we're talking about word count, I'm going to give you some key questions that you can ask to help figure out your process more in this area. That first question is, does it matter? And I tackled this in an earlier episode that was all about asking this question first, because I think sometimes we jump into the idea of course, increasing my word count matters. But does it? Are you in a place right now where writing faster is going to demonstrably help you? Or is it something that, while it seems like a good idea and people talk about it all the time, in fact, your life is so crazy that maybe being able to slow down and write a little more carefully or methodically, or just not put that pressure on yourself, is going to be the right thing. So ask first, does it matter? And then, of course, if it doesn't matter, why doesn't it matter? And if it does matter, why does it matter to you? And what kind of results are you going to expect if you invest in trying to write faster? Covering these questions is crucial as you're going into trying to achieve the goal of writing faster. Now, personally, my own experience with trying to write faster versus trying to write better has definitely been an up and down sort of trek, because I've often been in places where I had a limited amount of time to write. I worked as a full-time teacher for many years, and I did not have much time to write after I got all my grading done. I've also worked quite a lot with clients and do self-employment work and freelance work. And surprisingly, all the admin work with that and all the client work, which I enjoy doing, does often cut into my own writing time as well. And so for me, learning how to write faster is definitely a helpful thing, because sometimes I only have an hour, or sometimes I have more than that, but at the end of a long night, my brain is shot and I only really have an hour of useful brain space before I'm just going to color, binge watch a show, read a book, just, unload my brain and rest for a bit. And so there are all those perks to writing faster so that you can make more use of your time, get more bang for your buck, all of those things, get more of your stories out of your head, because, oh my goodness, so many times we're thinking, I only have these many books, or I only have this much time, and I have to focus on these stories. And then your brain just keeps coming up with new ones, and you go, I don't need more ideas right now. Like, really, I just need to write the ones I have. And so the idea is that if you can write faster, then you can get more of those ideas out of your head and onto paper. The struggle is real. I totally get it. But one of the cons to writing faster is that sometimes your quality really can suffer. And I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, because I know that quote's going around that says, Your first draft is your sandbox. You're shoveling sand in there. You're just shoveling sand in your sandbox. And when you edit, you'll polish. Now, this is where your own process comes into play. There are authors that this works for. There are authors that just basically unload their brain during their first draft, like a big pile of amorphous sand. And then the editing is where they actually tell their story. If that's your process and that's how it works for you, then that is fantastic, and own it. But there are other authors that don't necessarily want to work that way, or that's not the best way for them to do anything. I found that for me, sandbox writing, while that's a great phrase to tell myself in my head so that I can actually force myself to get words on the page when I'm feeling perfectionistic, I don't want those words to just be this random amorphous pile of sand. And when I did the novel writing competition, I would win through just training myself over and over again to write and write and write, no matter what it was, just get the words onto the page. And the problem is sometimes I would actually make it to 50,000 words in 3.5 weeks. And you're like, what's the problem? The problem is none of the words were usable. And I had that happen multiple times where nothing I wrote was usable. Now, I could say, well, that's okay. That's your sand in the sandbox. Or I could say, you know what? That was just practice writing. But when it started being, 8 years into being an author, I started getting really frustrated with this idea of just, writing words for the sake of writing words. And I said, you know what? I want to make sure the words that I'm writing actually have some potential hope of getting into my later drafts. I don't enjoy diving into my edits and trying to craft this big random pile of words into something story-like. That just doesn't resonate with my process. And so I need to find ways of writing better as well as writing faster. Just doing the speed is not enough for me anymore. And the thing is, there is a trade-off there in some respects. There is a cap. I believe there is a cap to how fast you can write quality words. Now, if you're going to choose genres that require less world building and very simple characters, then you can increase that speed even more. So if you're writing a very, very simple contemporary story where it's going to be a rom-com where you are following those tropes by the number and by the letter and you're keeping things very simple. Again, I'm not saying this isn't a good or bad thing. I'm just simply saying those stories exist. If you do that, you can churn out stories faster. You can write them faster because you're keeping things very, very simple. But the more that you add complexity to your storytelling, the more that you're going to write something more historical or just something with a twistier plot or something with a lot of world building, which as a science fiction and fantasy author, I'm all about the world building. When you do that, you're going to naturally slow down your writing just a bit because you have to do the world building in your story world and figure those things out as you're writing. It all has to kind of flow together. And so when you're thinking about writing faster or seeing people in the industry who are writing faster, think about what they're writing, think about how carefully they're going to a certain formula, and ask yourself again, do I want to do that? Do I want to make that trade-off? Do I want to write those kind of stories? And if you do, you have made your choice, and that is fantastic. But I think sometimes we don't think through that push and pull, those two different sides of the coin when we're thinking about writing faster. So part of writing faster and also writing words that are going to last to the final draft, or at least some of them will last to the final draft. So you're not just piling a huge vat of sand that you have to dig through, involves having some of your plot figured out ahead of time, involves having your world building squared away ahead of time, involves choices that are going to make it easier or harder to write your story. And that's where you have that tension. Now, can you balance this out with simply giving yourself more time to write in a day? Of course you can. And if you can write faster and have more hours in a day, you can definitely get your word count out there and definitely make large progress in your storytelling. But I am slightly following the assumption that if you're trying to write faster in some way, it's because you're also under some kind of time crunch, which we all are in some respects. You have to sleep, you have to eat. It'd be good to see people sometimes. Going outside and having a walk, getting some sunlight is a great idea. And as you start to grow your author life and career, you're going to have a backlist. You're going to have things that you have to do with marketing or cross promotions or stuff. And so that takes up more time. And so being able to write more effectively with that narrow window of time, writing faster but also better, can be very helpful. So I'm going to give you some additional questions that you can ask yourself as you're considering how to write faster. First, what genre are you writing in? How complex is that genre going to be? Are you going to try to say new and different and fresh things in that genre, or are you going to try to follow some basic formulas? There's nothing wrong with that, but you need to figure it out right away so that you don't set yourself in a place where you're like, I'm going to write super fast, but I'm also going to have this giant story world, and I'm also going to have this incredibly complex, twisty plot and everything. The more that you layer those things on, the more that it's going to take more time to get the words out because you're having to balance more things in your brain. You might also consider the length of book that you're going to write. And you actually can do different things to adjust your story length. If you have a simpler plot and again, simpler world building, then you could actually conceivably write a shorter, simpler story because there simply don't need to be as many words to finish the story and tell it well. Conversely, the more complex plot you have, the more complex vision you have, the more that your book is probably going to be longer. And a longer book can, in general, take a bit more to write, and it takes a bit more work to get everything onto the page the way you want. And so maybe that's not the best thing if you're trying to be a super speedster writer. So when you're considering writing faster, consider these key genre areas. Don't just think about, well, I'm going to do writing sprints or I'm going to time myself for those things. We'll go to some of those tips later on. But a lot of times it also comes down to your decision at the start, why it matters to you, how you're going to keep yourself motivated, and the kind of story that you're writing. How are you setting yourself up to make it easier on yourself versus harder? It's sort of similar to if you're going to try to run a marathon, maybe, especially if it's your first one, you want to run that marathon completely on flat level, a flat level trail. If you're trying to do your first marathon and you want to go over many, many mountain peaks and up and down and sideways and different elevations, you're kind of setting yourself up for a little bit more difficulty. In the same way, if you're considering how to train yourself to write faster, you might consider writing a simpler story to learn how to write that faster instead of trying to write a super complex epic story. Of course, the choice is ultimately up to you. This is something that I'm also actively balancing myself right now in my current work in progress because I really want to write it faster, but I also realize that I am writing the first book in a series. That can mean a little bit more setup, which can also mean it takes a little more time to get it going, and that can slow down writing word count. In the same way, I'm also doing more world building and I'm having to create new world building, which can also mean I write more slowly because I have to make up more things along the way, which, by the way, is part of the fun. So I don't want to guilt myself for taking more time to think up of cool things just because I haven't hit my 1,000 or 2,000 a day. If you stop enjoying the process and the reason why you're writing just to try to get to an artificial word count, I believe you're missing out on the whole fun of doing author life. Additionally, for this particular book, I chose complex world building, some really fun, different scenes, and I'm also doing a mystery element. Mystery elements, especially if you're not going by a very, careful formula pattern, take more time to set up. Now, I love mysteries and I binge mysteries, and so I put mysteries in my books. And so I just have to go into a book understanding that if it's going to have a complex mystery element, I can't put that pressure on myself to try to hit a crazy word count every evening. Some evenings I might just have to sit down with the mystery aspect and make sure all the pieces are in place and that I'm ready for the next part. And that is okay. And this is where it comes back to, again, having some self-awareness of your genre and your goals for that genre when you're trying to set this idea of writing faster. Now, I do have a couple of weird tricks that I'm actually doing for this particular work in progress that is making it a bit easier to get those words on the paper. So stay tuned. Those are coming up next. Now, the usual tricks that you can have for increasing your word count, besides choosing a certain kind of genre, besides figuring out your motivation for it, are community-based incentives. So doing writing sprints with someone else so that you're sitting there writing together. It can also be putting yourself in the right place, getting yourself a certain kind of music that maybe the beat will drive you into writing more. You're going to follow that pattern of the music, and that's going to help you just to keep going faster and faster as you're writing. You can also do shorter sprints with yourself. You can time yourself in various ways. And honestly, if you get into the practice of writing faster when you are in a groove, then it will come more naturally to you. It is a bit like a muscle, as well as making a careful choice of your terrain, so to speak, your genre and your plotting. But one weird thing that's actually helping me out right now is font choice. Yeah, believe it or not. So I have had experience in the past where when I'm writing a certain kind of story, I'll tweak the font of it to be something that I like more or that feels more aligned with that storytelling. So my fairy tales, I often write the first draft in Garamond font. Yes, I'm a font nerd, just a warning there. And I'll often write other kinds of stories in Times New Roman font, and I start associating that font with those stories. And for some reason, that association helps me write the story better and more effectively. And in this case, I'm choosing to write this story in a sans serif font, so it doesn't have the curly edges and things that Times New Roman does. Everything is straight when you're talking about the structure of the letters. I'm using a sans serif font, Calibri, which is one of my favorite fonts. And when Microsoft changed the default to Aptos, I was like, no. And I went back and changed it to Calibri because I'd gotten used to it. But I said, you know what? I am not going to write this story in Times New Roman. I'm going to write it in Calibri, and maybe that will trick my brain into writing it just a little bit speedier. Because when I think of sans serif font, I think of content I'm writing for online. I think of social media posts and those kind of things. And that's not something that I overthink. I figure out what I'm going to say in the social media post. I type it out, I press send or I press submit, and I'm done. And it's actually working for me. I'm actually writing a bit faster because I'm using a different font. So think about your font choices and how they might impact your writing speed. Something else I'm doing for this particular book and for these particular characters is when I'm thinking about how to write this story, I'm partly thinking about how I can just create individual obstacles for them. So I have an outline, so to speak, and I kind of know where I'm going. And since I have that mystery element, I have the mystery beats figured out. And that was one of the first things I had to do. But in terms of just figuring out scene by scene, a fair amount of what I'm doing is taking these characters who are both very, very driven characters in their own way. One's more driven in an introverted, empathetic way, and one is more driven in a very calculating, arrogant way. But they're both very driven. And so I go, okay, you're both driven. I am just going to see how many ways I can just kind of poke you and make your life hard, because they're both the kind of characters that will shape around that difficulty and come out in more interesting places. And it's led to some interesting things in my story. So I guess sometimes just antagonize your characters. I don't do this with all of my characters, but in this case, with this particular story, it does help give me some more ideas to get words on the page, to get scenes finished, etc. So this kind of tip really works well as you get to know your characters and as you figure out how to work with them in the story. I'm a very character-focused author, and so it works for me in that way. And one final thing I do is I actually take ideas from the songs I'm listening to when I'm writing. Now, I don't always listen to music when I'm writing, but when I do, a fair amount of the time it has lyrics. And I know a lot of authors will say, oh, well, the lyrics help me get into the feeling or the vibe, and I get that. But sometimes I'll actually listen to the lyrics and go, okay, that's an interesting moment or scene. How can I riff off of that? How can I take that idea and what would it look like with this character? A little bit different. But again, it helps me to play with my story and helps me to keep going with it. And again, this is a mystery style story. So in some ways, the patterns are fairly rigid because I have to get everything in order so that I make sure I deliver that payoff at the end. And I have to make sure my world building is all making sense. So if I can find ways that I can play with stuff and I can take just random things that I'm watching from a comedy sketch or listening to in a new song, and I can play around with that, then it can create more interesting things in the story. So basically, font choice, character antagonism, and Studio C or SNL skits are some of the ways that I'm getting my word count onto page faster and better in this round. feel free to borrow any of those, or feel free to drop your own tips and tricks for what works for you and helps you to get words on the page faster, better, more inspiring, and in ways that make sense for you. I'd love to hear and read those tips. This is Janeen Ippolito with Author Culture. Go forth and be awesome.